My mother-in-law died on a Tuesday, and my wife didn't come home until Thursday. Not because she was grieving somewhere private. Not because she needed time alone on the road. She was 2 hours away at a spa in Scottsdale when Ruth took her last breath in the hospital room, where I had been sitting for 11 hours straight, holding a woman's hand who had treated me better than her own daughter ever did. I called my wife 3 times. The first 2 went to voicemail. The third time she picked up, I could hear soft music in the background and the faint sound of someone offering her a warm towel. "I know," she said, before I even finished speaking. I already knew. I didn't ask how. I just sat there in that sterile hallway with a paper cup of cold coffee and realized something had shifted. Not just in the room down the hall, but in my entire life. Her name was Ruth Calloway, my mother-in-law, 67 years old, retired school teacher, the kind of woman who kept a vegetable garden even when her knees hurt, who sent birthday cards with handwritten notes, who once drove 40 minutes in the rain to bring me soup when I had the flu, when my own wife was on a girls' trip in Miami and couldn't be bothered to call. My wife's name is Diana. We had been married for 6 years. I want to be fair about this. Diana wasn't always the way she became. When we first met, she was funny and warm, and she used to call her mother every Sunday. I fell in love with the woman who cried at documentaries about the ocean, who kept a list of places she wanted to take her mom someday. Italy, New Orleans, Savannah in the spring. They never went to any of those places. Somewhere around year 3 of our marriage, something calcified in Diana. I couldn't name the exact moment. Maybe it was when her 2 closest friends started marrying men with much more money than I made as a high school history teacher in a small town outside of Phoenix. Maybe it was when she started spending more time on social media looking at other people's houses. Maybe it was just who she always was underneath, and I had been too in love to see it. Ruth saw it. She never said it directly. She was too gracious for that. But I noticed the way she would go quiet when Diana made certain comments. The way her eyes would drift to the window when Diana talked about wanting to move to Scottsdale, to upgrade the car, to stop shopping at the places we could actually afford. "You're a good man, Elliot," Ruth told me once. We were in her kitchen. I was helping her fix a leaky faucet while Diana sat in the living room scrolling through her phone. "Don't let anyone convince you that being good is ordinary." I didn't know what to do with that at the time. I just tightened the pipe fitting and said thank you and went back to the living room where my wife didn't look up from her screen. Ruth had her first stroke 14 months before she died. It was mild. That's what the doctors called it, a mild ischemic event, but it scared me badly. Diana took one look at the discharge paperwork and started talking about assisted living facilities, as though her mother was already an inconvenience to be managed. I said we should help her instead. That started an argument that lasted 3 days. Diana said I was being naive. She said we couldn't run our lives around her mother's health problems. She said her mother had a nest egg and could afford proper care. I said I would handle it, so I did. I started driving to Ruth's house in Glendale 3 evenings a week after school. I fixed what needed fixing. I took her to doctor's appointments when she didn't feel confident driving herself. I learned which pharmacist at her CVS knew her by name and always called ahead to make sure her prescriptions were ready. I helped her set up a tablet so she could video call her sister in Oregon. Small things. The kinds of things that don't look impressive from the outside but mean everything to the person receiving them. Diana came maybe once a month. Sometimes less. She and her mother would sit in the living room and make careful, polite conversation. The kind that 2 people have when they've stopped being honest with each other. I would find a reason to be in another room. Ruth and I used to talk, though. Really talk. She told me about growing up in Flagstaff, about teaching 3rd grade for 31 years, about Ruth's late husband Gerald, who died when Diana was only 12. She told me he used to say that money was like water. It would find the level of whoever was holding it. Some people, it raised up. Others, it just revealed what was already there. "Gerald would have liked you," she said once, without preamble, while I was helping her sort through some boxes in the garage. I didn't know what to say. I told her that meant a lot. She looked at me over the top of a cardboard box and said, "I know it does. That's why I said it." 14 months of that. 14 months of driving to Glendale while my wife found other things to do with her evenings. 14 months of learning what Ruth's good days looked like and what her bad days felt like. I was the one who noticed when her speech started getting slightly slower in October. I was the one who insisted on the follow-up MRI that found the second event had already happened, silently, while she slept. She declined quickly after that. By January, she needed more help than evening visits could provide. So I arranged for a home health aide to come in the mornings. A woman named Patricia, who was deeply competent and kind. I paid for it out of our savings. Diana did not object when I told her. She just nodded and said, "Okay." The way you say okay when something has already been decided and you are interested enough to be part of the deciding. Ruth passed on a Tuesday in February, peacefully the nurse said, which felt both true and insufficient. Patricia was there. I was there. Diana was in Scottsdale. The funeral was that Saturday. Diana wore a fitted black dress and stood at the front of the chapel like someone performing the role of grieving daughter for an audience she wanted to impress. She accepted condolences graciously. She cried at the right moments. I stood beside her and felt a distance I couldn't measure. Ruth's sister flew in from Oregon. Her name was Carol, and she was a blunter version of Ruth. Same intelligence, less patience for pretense. When Diana stepped away to take a phone call during the reception, Carol looked at me steadily and said, "You were the one with her at the end." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. Carol nodded slowly. "Ruth talked about you. More than you probably know." I didn't know what to do with that either. I just nodded back and excused myself to refill someone's coffee. 2 weeks after the funeral, we got a call from Ruth's attorney, a man named Douglas Pratt with an office in downtown Phoenix. He wanted us to come in the following Tuesday to discuss the estate. Diana's entire demeanor changed the night before that meeting. She was suddenly attentive in a way she hadn't been in months, asking if I wanted dinner, sitting close to me on the couch, talking about things she wanted to do together. I watched her and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like recognition. We sat in Douglas Pratt's office on a gray Tuesday morning, Diana with her hands folded in her lap and her posture very straight. Douglas read through the initial formalities, the assets of the estate, the general inventory, Ruth's house in Glendale, assessed at $620,000, investment accounts totaling approximately $1.4 million. A small life insurance policy, various personal property. Diana's breathing changed. I could hear it even though she was sitting 2 feet away. Then Douglas said, "Before we proceed to distribution, there are some things I need to clarify." He opened a second folder. 14 months ago, he said, Ruth Calloway came to this office and requested that we prepare updated estate documents. She was of sound mind and came alone, by her own request. He looked up. At that time, she made several significant amendments. Diana's hands tightened slightly in her lap. The property at 4417 North Crescent Drive in Glendale, Douglas continued, was transferred by deed to Elliot Marsh 14 months ago. The transfer was completed, recorded with Maricopa County, and is not part of the current estate. Diana said, "What?" Douglas kept his voice even. "The house is not in the estate, Mrs. Marsh, because it was no longer your mother's property at the time of her death. It was transferred to your husband." "She can't have done that," Diana said. "She didn't tell me. She was not required to," Douglas said simply. "It was her property." Diana turned to look at me. I had not known. That was the truth. I genuinely had not known. Ruth had said nothing. Not a word across 14 months of dinners and doctor's appointments and slow conversations in that Glendale kitchen. She had just quietly done it. I didn't know what my face showed in that moment. I hope it showed that I was as surprised as Diana was, because I was. Douglas continued. The investment accounts, he explained, were divided as follows. A trust of $200,000 had been established for Diana, structured to distribute $2,000 per month over a period of approximately 8 years. The remainder, just over $1.2 million, was directed to a charitable foundation Ruth had established the same day she visited Douglas's office. The foundation's stated purpose was arts education funding for rural Arizona schools. Diana stared at him for a long time. She gave $1 million to a charity, Diana finally said, very quietly, and left me $2,000 a month. Your mother left you a dependable, structured income for 8 years, Douglas said. She was deliberate about the decision. Did she leave a reason? Douglas reached into the folder one more time. He produced a sealed envelope and slid it across the desk toward Diana. On the front, in Ruth's careful schoolteacher handwriting, was Diana's name. Diana stared at it. She didn't open it in the office. She put it in her purse and stood up and walked out without looking at me. I sat there for another moment. I asked Douglas if Ruth had left anything for me in writing. He shook his head. No letter, but she did say something. The day she came in for the transfer documents, when I asked her if she was certain about her decisions. He paused. She said, "Elliot already has what I want to give him. He just doesn't know it yet." I thanked him and walked out into the February sunlight. Diana and I drove home in silence. When we got inside, she went straight upstairs. I made coffee. An hour later, she came back down and told me she wanted a divorce. I looked at her standing in our kitchen doorway. 6 years of marriage. I thought about the woman she used to be on Sunday phone calls with her mother. I thought about the list of places. Italy, New Orleans, Savannah in the spring. "Okay," I said. She seemed almost startled that I didn't argue. Then her expression settled into something harder. "I want my share of the house." I told her I would have a lawyer look at everything and we would handle it properly. She moved out 3 weeks later to a rental in Scottsdale she could afford with the trust distribution and help from a friend. The divorce was finalized 4 months after that. I kept the house in Glendale. Ruth's house, the one with the vegetable garden. I kept paying Patricia for a few weeks after Ruth passed, just to make sure she was properly transitioned to another family. It was the least I could do. I didn't move into Ruth's house right away. I rented it out at first, kept my apartment. I needed time before I could walk into that kitchen without feeling the weight of all those conversations. Diana called me 7 months after the divorce was final. I almost didn't pick up. Then I thought about Ruth telling me not to let anyone convince me that being good was ordinary, and I picked up. Diana's voice was different. Not soft exactly. I don't know if Diana does soft anymore, but stripped of the performance. She had lost her job at the marketing firm where she'd been working part-time. Her rental costs had gone up. The $2,000 a month from the trust was not covering things the way she'd calculated. She asked if she could borrow money. I was quiet for a moment. I thought about the spa in Scottsdale, the warm towel, the way she'd said "I know" before I'd even finished telling her that her mother was gone. Then I thought about what Ruth would have wanted. Not for Diana, specifically. For me. I told Diana I wouldn't lend her money. I told her that wouldn't help either of us. But I knew someone who was hiring, a school district administrator I had worked with for years, who had an opening for an office coordinator position. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Scottsdale. It was $32,000 a year, and health insurance and a reason to get up in the morning. I gave Diana her number. Diana was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That's it? That's what I have," I said. She hung up without thanking me. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter. Ruth's kitchen counter, as it turned out, because I had finally moved in by then, and I stood there for a minute looking out at the backyard. The vegetable garden had gone a little wild over the winter. I'd been meaning to tend to it but hadn't gotten there yet. The tomato cages were still standing from last season, bent and rust-spotted, waiting. I put on my jacket and went outside. I don't know if Diana took the job. I didn't ask, and she didn't call back to tell me. I hope she did, genuinely. Not because it would mean anything for me, but because I think Ruth hoped her daughter would eventually understand that a life built on what you actually earn, what you actually tend to, is the only kind that holds. I know that now more than I ever did. I learned it in a kitchen in Glendale, over 2 years of Tuesday evenings and cold coffee and conversations about Gerald and what water does when it finds its level. Ruth left me a house I didn't expect, and a lesson I'm still learning how to carry. I think that was the point. I still go out to the garden most weekends now. The tomatoes came back on their own this spring. Volunteer plants from last year's seeds, reaching up through the soil without being asked. I put the cages back up, the rust-spotted ones. I figured they still had at least one more season in them. I think about Ruth every time I'm out there. I think she'd be pleased about the tomatoes. I think she'd have some practical thing to say about the cages. Something that also meant something else, the way she always did. I'm 31 years old. I own a house with a garden. I teach history to 16-year-olds who sometimes actually care about it. I have quiet evenings and an honest life and a memory of a woman who saw me clearly and decided that was worth something. I didn't get the $1 million. I think I got the better thing. I've thought a lot about why things ended the way they did. Not just for Diana, but for both of us. And I keep coming back to something simple. The life you build is made entirely out of the choices you make when no one is watching, when there's no reward coming, when the only reason to do the right thing is that it's the right thing. I drove to Glendale 3 evenings a week for 14 months. No one asked me to keep going after the first few visits. No one would have noticed if I'd quietly stopped. Ruth wouldn't have blamed me. She wasn't the kind of woman who kept score. But I kept going because I genuinely wanted to, because somewhere along the way those Tuesday evenings stopped feeling like obligation and started feeling like the most honest part of my week. That's not virtue. That's just what happens when you choose to show up for people. Eventually, it shapes who you are. Diana made different choices. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, and I mean that. She chose comfort over presence, distance over difficulty. And when the money she expected didn't materialize the way she'd planned, there was nothing underneath to hold her up. That's not a punishment anyone designed for her. That's just the natural consequence of years of choosing the easier thing. You can't withdraw from an account you never deposited into. Ruth understood this. I think she understood it better than most people I've ever met. She was a school teacher for 31 years, which means she spent 3 decades watching young people figure out who they were going to be. Watching some of them choose curiosity and effort and honesty, and watching others choose shortcuts. She knew what those choices compounded into over time. She knew that character isn't a thing you declare. It's a thing you demonstrate, slowly, in the ordinary moments that don't feel like they matter. What she left me wasn't really a house. It was a record. A quiet, legal, undeniable record of what she had observed across 14 months of Tuesday evenings and pharmacy pickups and conversations in a Glendale kitchen. She saw clearly, and she acted on what she saw. That's one of the most dignified things one person can do for another. I'm not the same person I was 6 years ago when I married Diana. I'm steadier. I know better what I value and what I don't. I know that a life built on honesty and genuine effort holds together in ways that a life built on expectation never does. Integrity doesn't announce itself. It just quietly determines everything. What you can look back on without flinching. Who trusts you when it counts. What remains after everything else has been stripped away. The tomatoes came back on their own this spring. I didn't plant them. They just came. And I thought, standing out there in Ruth's garden with the rust-spotted cages and the early Arizona sun, that this is more or less how it goes. You tend to something long enough, honestly enough, and it finds a way to return to you. Maybe not in the form you expected, maybe not on the timeline you hoped for, but it comes back. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.